Well, good evening and welcome to Coalition for Conservation's webinar on the future of energy and renewables. I'll start by paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the land where I live and I work, recognizing their continuing connection and their contribution to our environment and culture. I'm Cristina Talaco, the chair of C4C, which is a center-right movement supporting conservation and decarbonization. And tonight, we are delighted to have the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction, Angus Taylor, as our special guest once again. Last June, the minister joined us discussing the potential of hydrogen as the fuel cell of the future. But a lot has happened since then, both at government level and industry level. So we're looking forward to getting an update on the various announcements and new developments. Now, we're also having the pleasure of having Minister of International Development and the Pacific, Alex Hawke, with us, joining at the end of the session to do a wrap up, and also to say a few words on the work that he's doing around climate resilience and investment in renewables in the Pacific. We'll have a Q&A at the end, so please type your questions for the minister in the Q&A box. And in the interest of time, and because the state of origin is on tonight, I will skip the formal introductions. Minister, welcome. Thank you for joining us once again. Can you tell us about the developments in the energy agenda since we last saw you, and how do you think the future holds for Australia?
Well, thanks, Christina. Good evening to you and everyone on this webinar. Thank you again for having me for the second time. Last time was back in June. We talked about hydrogen. It was before the budget and it was before the first technology statement, low emissions technology statement. And of course, a great deal has been announced since then. So what I thought I would do is just give a brief overview of some of those announcements, which build on the discussion we had last time, and then no doubt we'll have a good Q&A session after that. So the starting point, of course, is the principles that I described last time when we spoke, which was a focus for the government, the policy focus on technology, not taxes, on delivering. And this has been a particular focus for the Australian government to deliver on Kyoto, to deliver on Paris. And of course, we're continuing to see improvement on that. We'll see our next emissions statement coming out in December, which will give a wrap up for the year, and will give also a wrap up for the Kyoto era, which finished on the 30th of June. The last estimates were that we will beat our Kyoto targets by about 430 million tonnes, which is almost a year's worth of emissions, which is a fantastic outcome. But a technology-driven approach is what's characterised our focus, and of course that's been absolutely central in what we've announced since the last session. And the way we think about this, just to recap on that, is that there are ultimately, when you boil it down, two ways to reduce emissions. One is to deploy new technologies which come into parity, commercial parity, with their higher emitting alternatives. That doesn't impose an economic burden. An economist's sort of approach to this is to say, well, if the technology is better than the high emitting alternative, it will be chosen. It will be chosen because the economics dictate that. And there won't be an economic burden because people are making the choice to use that particular technology, whether it's an electric vehicle or it's a particular fuel source for the electricity sector or indeed for industry. But the alternative is taxes, and that means imposing a cost which will inevitably curb economic activity. And of course, as someone on the centre right of politics, any imposition on economic opportunity and economic activity is something we want to avoid as much as we possibly can. And of course, that's central to our policy. Now, the low emissions technology statement was an overview, a strategy, and we gave an overview of that strategy, which focuses on technology, not taxes. And in fact, in that statement, the first of the statements, and they'll be updated each year, we focused on 5 priority technologies which we think can really move the dial, where we believe there is potential to bring down costs in a fairly rapid, a short period of time, in a rapid way, and where those technologies can come into parity with their alternatives, or in the case of 2 of them, which are negative technologies, which are technologies that can absorb carbon, where the economics can come to a point where it's going to be attractive for people to deploy those technologies. We also gave an overview of a series of enabling technologies, of watching brief technologies, others that we think may show potential into the future. But the 5 priority technologies were the real focus. And those technologies were very carefully chosen because they have a couple of characteristics. Number one is they can reduce emissions dramatically in Australia. And number 2, and importantly, they can reduce emissions around the world. I mean, we should never forget that this is a global endeavour, and it must be, because we don't move the dial on this issue unless we move emissions at a global level. 1.3% of emissions from Australia, yes, we have to do our bit, but ultimately it will be new technologies that decarbonise a whole range of sectors, not just the electricity sector, that's going to move the dial at the global level, particularly when you come to developing countries where they simply can't wear major economic burdens. The 5 technologies we chose will either eliminate or substantially reduce emissions in sectors responsible for 90% of the world's emissions. 90% of the world's emissions, that's 45 billion tonnes. That those technologies can target. That's 45 billion tonnes a year. Put it in perspective, we're around 530 million tonnes, so we're a very small part of that total. But these technologies have the potential across that very, very large quantum of global emissions. But they're also technologies where Australia has competitive advantage, and this is a crucial point. There are areas where there will be decarbonisation where we don't necessarily have competitive advantage, but these are 5 areas where we do. And to quickly go through them, one that we spoke about last time at length was hydrogen, and we see hydrogen as enormously important in 2 respects in particular. One, as an industrial feedstock. It is an industrial feedstock today, of course. It's used today for producing fertiliser or ammonium nitrate, range of plastics, a range of other materials. But it is also important because it's a fantastic medium for stored energy. We can actually store energy as hydrogen. Intermittent renewables are getting increasingly cheaper generating energy, but their challenge is to deliver the load, the energy required for a particular customer load, and that ultimately will require a significant amount of storage. And the hardest part of that is longer duration storage, which is why we think pump hydro has great potential into the future, but hydrogen is another important technology for longer duration storage. Electricity storage itself is one of the 5 technologies. Low emission steel and aluminium production. I mean, this is enormously important to bring down global emissions. The steel industry is responsible for a significant proportion of the world's emissions, as is the aluminium industry. They're 2, aluminium industry even more so. And if we're to decarbonise globally, we have to find ways of producing steel and aluminium with lower emissions. Carbon capture and storage and soil carbon, the 2 negative technologies, if you like, negative in the sense that they can actually absorb emissions rather than reduce emitting activities or reduce emissions from current activities. So those 5 are the priorities. Now, for each one of them, we've set very clear targets. H2 under 2, which is hydrogen down to under $2 a kilogram. Low emission steel, for instance, we've set a target of $900 Australian a tonne, which would make that low emission steel competitive with current higher emitting steel alternatives through blast furnaces in particular, which is the primary technology used for producing steel from iron ore. Of course, aluminium production at $2,700 a tonne, and so on. So each one of these has a very, very specific target. And those targets are extremely important, because once we approach those levels, we'll start to see the natural uptake of those technologies. We think that the uptake will happen before that. So if you take hydrogen, for instance, there's niche opportunities in microgrids and so on that will happen at quite a high price point, but mass market reach for hydrogen requires it to get to under $2 a kilogram. So we'll see that uptake increase. It's sort of a demand curve, if you like, as the costs come down. But the key here is to bring those costs down. Now, alongside the low emissions technology statement, which we'll update each year. And I'm sure there's views from many people listening about which technology we should have put more emphasis on and which less, and that's all important debate. The whole point about this is it's a process, it's ongoing. The technology portfolios need to be seen as a portfolio that constantly need refinement. And so the annual update, which will be made to the Parliament, is a very, very important part of saying, okay, we're making progress here, we're disappointed on this one, and so we may need to adjust it in a particular way. And that constant update of the portfolio and the focus and the strategy is extremely important. Now, the other important event that's occurred since we last spoke, of course, was the budget. And the budget had in it an enormous amount of support for this low emissions technology statement, but also for other parts of the government's focus on bringing down emissions, and of course, more broadly, on making sure we've got an affordable, reliable energy system. Because, as I've said many times on this webinar and previous ones, ultimately, we don't want to impose an economic burden on Australians, on hardworking Australians, whether they're in industry or small business or households, indeed, particularly at a time like this. And so, that is absolutely crucially important to our focus. So the budget had in it a whole range of initiatives. Let me focus on a couple, which I think are particularly linked to that low emission technology statement. We've refunded ARENA. And we've done it in a slightly different way to how we've done it in the past. There's the base funding, which is in line with past funding of ARENA, which effectively gives them a level of funding which allows ARENA to continue to focus on those critical areas, including those 5 priority technologies that I've outlined. But we've also given to ARENA a series of programs that they will administer in areas relating to emissions reduction. So an example of that is the Future Fuels program. I talked last time when we spoke about the importance of actually enabling new technologies into the marketplace with supporting infrastructure. One example of that's electric vehicles. The Future Fuel program is all about making sure the infrastructure is in place to make sure, as the costs of electric vehicles come down, and particularly the cost of batteries, which is the big cost in electric vehicles, as that cost continues to come down, we have the infrastructure in place where the uptake is likely to occur to support that uptake. And so fleets, for instance, which is an area where we see great potential for early uptake, making sure those electric vehicle fleets have access to the charging infrastructure they need. That's not as trivial as it sounds. Actually, it's quite a big challenge, not just because you've got to get the charging infrastructure itself in place, but because the electricity grid has to be able to support that charging infrastructure. And for those who with a more technical sort of focus on this, 3-phase power is going to be an important part of that to get the fast charging infrastructure that we need. So significant focus on refunding of ARENA in the budget. There's a range of other initiatives supporting the low emissions technology statement in carbon capture and storage. Soil carbon, there's a real focus, and it's an area of technology that I think has enormous potential for Australia, where we really can lead the world. The focus there and the budget initiatives there are particularly focused on how we better measure soil carbon. We're very confident that if we can measure it well, we can pay for it through the Climate Solutions Fund. And indeed, there's enormous interest from the corporate sector in paying for soil carbon initiatives, and this voluntary credit market and the potential of that is an important part of what we're seeking to encourage here. But the measurement has been the real challenge. It's been too expensive. Farmers can measure soil carbon now. They do it all the time, but it has been very expensive. So bringing down the cost of measurement, we've set ourselves a target of $3 per year per hectare. So it's very specific. We know exactly where we want to get to on this. We know the range of technologies that are capable of supporting it, and we're funding in the budget to make sure that we can do that. And there's a range of other initiatives, and I'm sure there'll be questions along those lines. I do want to make one final comment on the low emissions technology statement before we wrap up and move to questions, Christina. And it's about international collaboration. This is, when it comes to technology, this is enormously important. The technology challenge, as I said, is a global one. If one country cracks a really difficult problem, every country in the world can use that. That's the wonderful thing about technology, is that having a large global population of researchers, we've got more people in R&D in the world today than any time in human history by a significant margin, and it continues to grow. So solving the problem in one country, or solving one part of a particular problem to enable the technology and get it to the point where it's economic in one country, of course, is something that can be then used across the world. These are not intellectual property is not a disposable asset. It's not a scarce resource. It's a shareable resource. And it's the wonderful thing about using technology to solve difficult problems. But it does mean that international collaboration is enormously important. We see real potential here. The Prime Minister is in Japan, has been in Japan this week. We see, for instance, enormous potential to work with the Japanese on a range of technologies. Hydrogen is at the top of the list. To put it in perspective, the Japanese have seen emissions in the last decade in their electricity grid increase by 25%. In that time, our emissions in our electricity grid have fallen by 18%. So they have a very significant problem. Now, the reason why the last decade is relevant is that covers the time when Fukushima, we saw the accident at Fukushima. They've had to take their nuclear power stations out. They've had to make much more use of coal. And that's a real problem for the Japanese to reach their shorter term targets, or indeed longer term targets and goals. And so there is enormous potential for us as a traditional supplier of energy to Japan to not just supply the energy, but actually work with them on the technology that's going to give them the solution they need. They've committed to getting 30% hydrogen into as many of their gas and coal generators as they can as soon as possible. They believe they can actually feed the hydrogen or ammonia, as the case may be, direct into those generators. That's a pretty exciting prospect. They don't have the land or the opportunity to build the renewable assets they need to do this. We do. But there's many problems that have to be solved to get the economics to work. If we can get the cost down to $5 a kilogram, we get a start. And if we get it down to closer to under $2 a kilogram as the target is that we've set, then we see enormous potential to supply hydrogen to the Japanese, just as we have been a major supplier of iron ore, of coal, and of LNG in recent years to the Japanese. We go to the next stage of energy supply to a country with whom we have a wonderful, trusted relationship and a long-term history, of course, of very good supply of energy for us and for the Japanese. So that's one example of an international collaboration. It's very real. It's very pragmatic. It means we can scale our hydrogen industry in a way that we never could if we were only thinking about domestic supply for Australia, because we're a much smaller market domestically than even Japan alone. But there's other countries like Korea and Southeast Asia and elsewhere where we see similar opportunities. So there's a really lovely example of the international collaborations. That one is particularly interesting because it's both a supply relationship, offers potential as a supply relationship, and on technology collaboration. We're already well advanced. The Latrobe Valley Supply Chain Project is expecting to achieve first production in the very, very near future. We're also looking at a range of other projects. The budget includes $70 million for Australia's first major hydrogen hub. We're looking at that. That's a range of possible options for that. We certainly don't want the first to be the last. Of course, thinking about exports will be an important part of thinking about that hydrogen hub. So there's a lovely example of those international collaborations, and I could go through a range of others that are similarly interesting. So I'll stop there, Christina, and very happy to take questions.
Thanks, Angus. And it's obvious that you have this passion for innovation, and you've been focusing on the technology pathway to reach a net zero. And I can see there's so much opportunity for Australia in the renewable sector. And like you mentioned, becoming an exporter of renewables as well. But for many people, it's still unclear how we get there without the targets. So I guess their argument is that targets give strong market signals for business and for investors. So if you're relying on that investment for that deployment of these technologies you're talking about, and investors are relying heavily on market signals, what are the strongest signals that will give them? that will give those people the same level of confidence that a target would? Where is the level of confidence?
So we have targets, Christina. Let's be very clear about this. And I'll make a couple of comments about targets. So we have targets. There's no ambiguity about this. Some people would like a different target. I understand that. But our focus is on balance and a target that can get to an outcome in a timely way, and we beat it. You know, other countries will set targets and miss. I can go through each of the countries that have missed their targets. New Zealand and Canada have, of course, fell out of Kyoto and certainly won't reach the targets that they initially set. Our approach is to set a target and beat it. We have a 2030 target, 26% emission reduction target. We want to get to net zero as soon as possible. That's part of the Paris Agreement. And of course, you know, at the end of the day, a target isn't bankable. You can't invest on a target. You invest on a specific initiative that the government has taken, or more importantly, a specific technology that has come into the money, that's working, that's commercial, that's attractive. And of course, if you look at the history of new technologies, which is what we're talking about here, investment has occurred because those technologies are working. You know, Henry Ford invested in cars to replace horses because cars were an attractive technology to replace a horse. And he didn't do it because the government had a target. He did it because the technology worked. Now, that's not to say targets aren't important. It's to say investment will follow the commercial opportunity from a technology that's coming into the money. Now, we want co-investment in many important areas. In fact, we've pointed out in the low emissions technology statement that we're now investing about $18 billion across these technologies. Our experience is that for every dollar we invest, we get about $3 of private and state government investment. So that means that the total we're looking for across these technologies is about $70 billion, which is a very, very significant number. That number is based on our experience. It's not sort of, you know, it's a very real experience with money we've invested through the CFC and ARENA over time. And we know more about this than most countries in the world, having what's probably the most successful low emissions bank, green bank in the world in the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So we're sending very strong signals in the way we spend this money. And if you take hydrogen, you know, we've already invested. Actually, last time I spoke to you, it was about 500 million. Of course, there was another 70 million in the budget for the hydrogen hub, and of course the extra funding for ARENA. You'd expect the total number to be significantly north now of 500 million in hydrogen. That is sending a very clear signal to business. We'll work with you. We want your leverage. We want state governments' leverage as well. That combined investment is what will work. Now, you know, we're getting leverage of far more than that in many places. So if you take that Latrobe Valley supply chain project I talked about, we've put $50 million in. The total investment across that project is over $500 million. So we're expecting, you know, we are expecting significant leverage. The Climate Solutions Fund is similar. You know, obviously $2 billion we announced some time back, and that's taking over in addition to what's in the Emissions Reduction Fund. And again, you know, we'll see significant private sector investment on the back of that. So that's how we send the very strong signals. As I say, we'll continue to update our performance versus, you know, target years 2030. Our target will go out beyond that, and we are obviously, as the Prime Minister said just in the last couple of days, and I've said many times, we want to get to net zero as soon as possible. But the pathway will be there because we have technologies that can get us there, not because we're slashing industry, slashing jobs and slashing regions in order to get emissions down.
Right. I still believe that one doesn't exclude the other. I think if you're, it sounds like
well, we have very clear targets, Christina, and but my point is that you don't invest on a target. You invest because there's real money to be made, and that is where we're sending the signals, and we'll continue to.
Sure. And it looks like we're getting there. Probably we'll get there earlier than we even envisaged. I believe what's happening in the world the world underestimated the rate of this technological improvement in the last decade, and we can see how fast things are happening. But how does the technology-driven plan accounts for that speed in which all these new technologies are overtaking each other? You mentioned that, we're picking some, but then we have to review which ones are doing better than the others. But let me put it this way. How do we avoid what happened in Australia with the National Broadband Network, the NBN, that cost us a lot of money and left Australia with this internet speed that lags well behind most advanced countries?
Well, I don't think it does. I dispute that. I think that's actually just quite wrong. But I'm not the communications minister, so I'll leave that defense to him. But I don't want to.
How do we avoid?
I
guess it's an example. How do we avoid? Say we're putting a lot of effort in one technology, but others start appearing. Is your plan to review them at a certain time? At what point in time do we start reviewing? You're going to start reviewing those technologies in your roadmap? Yeah, no,
it's a very good question and a very fair question. And so just to pick up on something you did say beyond your point about the NBN, you said some technologies have exceeded expectations, and that's quite right. But there's some technologies that haven't. So and this is the important point about technology: is it is a portfolio. You must treat it as a portfolio. There will be some which do better than you expect, and some will do worse. And if I go back historically, the one that's, I think, shot the lights out, so to speak, has done extremely well has been solar. And you started to see that a few years back, some really rapid gains in efficiency, reductions in cost, of course. But there are others like geothermal or tidal, where there was great hope. But we haven't seen the promise yet. Now, that's not to say those technologies won't get there. I mean, Amara's law, which is, I think, one of the great sort of principles of technology, is great technologies tend to be underestimated, or overestimated in the short term and underestimated in the long term. And I think that's quite true. So it's very unpredictable. It's quite non-linear. But the point I would make is this is why we have to have a portfolio. It's why we have to have more than one. I mean, Alan Finkel, as of course the person who led the work behind the low emissions technology statement, makes the point constantly that the greatest challenge we have is we don't have enough technologies in the race. It would be good to have more, given the scale of the challenge and the number of industries we have to decarbonise and the number of challenges we face. I mean, if you just look at aluminium smelting, for instance, great. We actually know quite a lot about how to reduce emissions in the production of electricity. Producing it 24/7, 365 days a year is more challenging, which is why storage becomes so important. But there's a lot we don't know about how to decarbonise the electrolysis process itself, which uses a carbon rod. That we have a long way to go. So we need a significant portfolio here, and we need to be continually adjusting. And that means if it is becoming clear that the private sector doesn't want to invest in a technology because it's not showing prospects, then that sends a very strong signal to the government. It's why this leverage ratio of 3 to 1 that we're seeking to achieve is so important, because it does send a signal. It's not just a matter of us sending signals to the private sector. It's actually a matter of the private sector sending signals to the government. And that's all part of how we're thinking about how we continually update this statement.
So true. And what about the gas-led recovery? That's been such a topic of debate at the moment. I think for me, on one side, I've been hearing a lot from experts that the primary role that gas will play in our energy matrix will be more like a backup source, so that it's used when we have major shortages. But on the other side of the equation, there's the cost of gas, and a lot of people believe it's not the cleanest form of energy or not the most advanced. So what is our take on, what's the real agenda for gas, Angus?
Well, I mean, the thing about gas is that it can be affordable, it can be reliable, and it can be low emissions. Now, that it depends on how you use it. And I'd start from the point which I always start from, which is that most systems, including energy systems, work best when there's balance. There is a tendency in this debate to say, look, I have a favourite source of fuel and it should dominate everything. And of course, that is not how systems work. It's certainly not how energy systems have worked historically. Right across the world, energy systems have used a mix of fuel sources. Now, the great challenge we have with balance at the moment is we're seeing about $9 billion of investment in intermittent renewables each year. Last year, that's what the number was. This year, we're expecting it to be pretty much the same from the Clean Energy Regulator. That's over 6 gigawatts of capacity, which is a stupendous amount. An increasing proportion of that is household solar, and our challenge is to get the balance in the system. Now, that balance can be achieved through hydro, pump hydro. It can be achieved through batteries, although batteries at this point, with the costs of them, were well for short duration and frequency control, much more challenging for longer duration backup, or gas. And right now, the economics is such that gas, a mix of gas and pump hydro is going to be the lowest cost source. Alongside batteries, I think there's real potential to, in fact, we've just invested in a battery in Western Australia, potential to use batteries to manage the disruptions we're seeing to the system, particularly the short run disruptions that can be dealt with in a shorter duration storage, with a shorter duration storage. But we still need that longer duration backup. A night lasts 12 hours. Of course, across the course of a season, you'll have periods where wind and solar is producing a lot less, and times of year when they're producing a lot more. And you need to have that balance. So that's the role that gas can play in the electricity system. It's different from the role it's played historically, and I think there's a lot of confusion about this. Gas has been in Australia and many countries in the world used as a baseload source of energy. I think it'll be less about baseload and more about flexing, and that's the role it can play. If you combine, say, solar and gas as a source of fuel for electricity, it's actually a low emission source because the gas is not on all the time. It's on when you need it. And the beautiful thing is, over time, increasingly, if the Japanese are right, gas generators can also use a portion of hydrogen. And we're seeing now dual fuel generators emerging. I think most of the generators that get built in the next little while, gas generators, will be dual fuel, and they'll be able to use hydrogen as well. The other point I make about gas is it is used as much in Australia and perhaps more around the world, not as a heat source, but as an industrial feedstock. This is very, very important. The food we eat every day is mostly produced, the grains in particular, produced from farms that use nitrogen fertiliser, and that is made from gas. Now, there is potential over time to use low emissions hydrogen from a combination of electrolysis and sequestered gas to reduce the emissions needed for using hydrogen as a feedstock for fertiliser or ammonium nitrate or plastics or whatever it is that you want to do. But again, the economics of that has got to improve. I mean, if gas costs $5 a kilo to produce now, to be competitive, if hydrogen costs $5 a kilogram to produce now, it's got to come down to close to $1 per kilogram to be competitive. And so that's why it's so important that this hydrogen work that we're doing really focus on bringing those costs down as quickly as possible. So it's going to be important for many years to come. If we all want to keep eating, if we want to feed $7 billion in the world, we don't have a simple solution for that overnight, and gas is important to it. The final point I'd make, you made a point about price. Look, there's some mythology around this, and I'm going to say that the Grattan report that came out earlier this week was deeply flawed. You could drive a truck through it. The price of gas has more than halved in the last 18 months. And the Grattan report showed a chart saying, look how high the price of gas was. They cut it off in 2018. I mean, that is actually, frankly, intellectually dishonest. The price of gas has come down very substantially. That is a global phenomenon. If you look at the futures price discovery now comes out of the United States, Henry Hub in the United States. The futures price for gas out to 2030 is way lower than it has been in recent years. So I think this mythology that gas will be priced out of the market is actually just at odds with what the market is saying. But the broader point I would make that's important here, Christina, is the answer here is balance. The balance will change. The balance will evolve towards low emissions as these technologies continue to improve. Gas will be part of that balance for many years to come, and gas can be consistent with significant reductions in emissions, as we've seen in the UK, in Europe, in the United States and in Australia.
Thank you. And since you're talking about price, well, since you've become minister, the wholesale prices of electricity seem to have gone down significantly. Can you explain, is that to do with renewables? What were the measures that helped decrease those prices? And more importantly, how do you keep those prices low as the demand increases?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So look, there's three things that I think are at the heart of it. Number one is we're seeing more supply coming into the market, and a large portion of that is solar and wind, not all of it, and particularly in the last year, household solar. And that is putting downward pressure on, that extra supply is putting downward pressure on prices. But there's a second complementary piece to this, which is very, very important, which is that we're not losing the supply. So we saw an enormous amount of renewables going in Victoria, and then we, in one fell swoop, lost Hazelwood. And that was a disaster for price. In fact, the wholesale prices doubled as a result of that. So the key here is to have more supply coming in without the, let's call it the random, unplanned loss of supply at the other end. That balance is enormously important. Now, we've been getting that balance right in the last little while. It's why we've been so concerned about the loss of Liddell in the New South Wales market, to make sure there is a baton change here. That is very, very important. Because, you know, hardworking Australians who rely on having an affordable, reliable supply of energy for their households or for their jobs, if they suddenly see the price of electricity spiking because there's been a big loss of supply in the market, they start to question about, you know, the whole strategy that governments are pursuing, and frankly, the reduction in emissions becomes a whole lot harder. So it's very, very important we get this right. There's a third part to it, alongside more supply in, less supply out, and that is the price of gas has had a very significant impact in the last 18 months. The price of gas, since the closure of Hazelwood, interestingly, has played a more important role in pricing electricity. They're almost perfectly correlated. So a $1 per gigajoule reduction in the price of gas is roughly equivalent to $10 per megawatt hour reduction in the price of electricity. They've tracked each other down, and so the lower cost of gas has been very important because it has been the marginal fuel source in the market, and that has been very helpful. So the final part of your question, which is how do we see a continuation of that? More supply in, we avoid random unplanned loss of supply, and we continue to contain the price of gas. And those three things combined, I am very, very confident will result in two things: lower prices and lower emissions. And that's what we all want to see.
Thank you. Now, the nature of your portfolio, just moving away from the technology and prices, just the nature of a portfolio, and it seems to be quite difficult because on one hand, you're balancing this energy reliability and prices down and affordability. On the other side of your portfolio, it's emissions reductions. What has been the biggest challenge for you so far? I mean, you could say it's the media perhaps, but what's the biggest challenge for you in your portfolio so far? And what would you say will be or is your biggest achievement so far?
Yeah, just before I answer that, I saw someone just put up a note saying, did he say gas at $10 a megawatt hour? You don't measure price of gas in $10 a megawatt hour. What the point I just made was that $1 a gigajoule of the price of gas is equivalent to about $10 per megawatt hour of the price of electricity. So that's just clarifying that point that I think someone was asking.
I'm glad you spotted that.
Look, yeah. So Christina, in terms of, you know, achievements, look, it is the combination of a lower energy costs, lower electricity prices, lower gas prices with lower emissions. Now, I have three really simple KPIs. Meet our Kyoto and Paris goals. It's now Paris, we've finished Kyoto. And ensure we have affordable, reliable energy in this country. Now, they have been really difficult things to reconcile. If you impose a carbon tax, they become more difficult to reconcile. right? Which is why, you know, we like this technology-led approach, because it allows you to do both. So they're the goals. And the thing I'm proudest of is that we're achieving them. You know, I'll give you another example from Kyoto. And again, there are many skeptics out there, but the facts are important. So when we got into government, the forecast for emissions for this year, 2020, from Labor, the final year they were in power, was that emissions would be around 630 million tonnes. 630 million tonnes. And that was with their carbon tax. Now, that wasn't low enough to meet Kyoto, by the way. So the way they were going to meet Kyoto was to buy international credits. So when we got into government, the plan was a carbon tax, 630 million tonnes of emissions this year, and a failure to meet Kyoto, but they'd fill the gap with international credits. Well, I'll tell you what's happened. We got rid of the carbon tax. Emissions this year, latest forecast around 530 million tonnes, and we'll see what it comes out at. We'll find out in the next few weeks. So it's 100 million tonnes lower, almost 20% lower than they were. And of course, there's been no need to use international credits. I mean, we've absolutely smashed our Kyoto targets. So that is an absolutely fantastic outcome. We do over-deliver as a country. That's our approach. As I said, there's many countries who have set targets and never delivered on them. But we don't do that. And, you know, this is the approach we take. Greg Hunt was really the one who set this approach in motion. Set a sensible target. Don't set a target you don't think you can meet, and then smash it. And that's exactly what we've been doing. I'm very confident we'll do that with our 2030 targets. I'm very confident that we'll do it as we reach out into time periods further out into the future. But that's what I'm proud of, is we have been delivering, and those KPIs, those really critical goals that I have as a minister. There's few who've got more transparency and clarity on their KPIs than me. We've been getting there. We're going to keep pushing hard, and I'm confident we can continue to.
You've just answered my next question, which was the carryover credits. So thank you for that. But if we have a vaccine next year, are you going to attend COP26?
Yeah, of course, yeah, no, very much so. And I certainly hope we have a vaccine. I'm a believer in technology. I'm a believer in technology portfolios. And we were talking before, Krista and I were talking before about how, in fact, the fact that the world has made bets on a range of technologies here has meant that we have some that are front runners that are looking pretty good now for the vaccine. So just as I am an optimist when it comes to our portfolio of emissions reductions technologies, I'm also an optimist that we're going to succeed on the vaccines too, because we have taken this globally collaborative approach. We've had a portfolio. We're backing in the ones that look like they're winning, and I think that's a good model for how we approach technology for emissions reduction as well.
We've got heaps of questions for you from the audience now, and just one more before I open to the audience. In terms of politics, what would be your unifying message that would transcend this polarization between those people who are concerned about emissions and the environment and those people whose livelihoods will still depend a lot on the economy of fossil fuels? How do you reconcile these perceived, I guess, competing interests between the metropolitan areas and, like, central Queensland, for example?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question, Christina, and it is really the heart of the matter, and it's not just the heart of the matter for Australia; it's the heart of the matter for the world. Because if you're poor and living in India or Southeast Asia, you think about the world in a fundamentally different way than if you're wealthy in a wealthy part of Australia. The role of energy in your life is quite different. If you work in a professional job in the CBD of Sydney, energy costs are a relatively small part of your life, certainly your household and also your business. But if you're working in a steel mill in India, it is a huge part of your life because that business is no longer competitive if it doesn't have an affordable, reliable supply of energy. So the important thing, I think, here is to be respectful, to listen, and to acknowledge that the points of view of that range of polarized perspectives are legitimate. And this is what we seek to do all the time. And that's why I say the most important part of this solution is balance. The idea that we can switch our energy system overnight, we can't. If we did, well, technically we may be able to, but if we did, we'd wipe out huge numbers of jobs. We'd wipe out towns. We'd wipe out, people's futures and livelihoods and aspirations and opportunities. So balance is the way forward. And I think if we do this in a sensible way, deploying technology. I mean, even the opportunity to feed hydrogen into existing generators is a very different story from saying we're going to wipe it all out and replace it with something else in a different location. And this is the kind of approach that I think globally will succeed. It does mean it's got to be rapid evolution, not revolution. It does mean that we all have to be very respectful of the range of points of view. Now, I know that is hard in a debate which is very emotive at times. I understand that, and I see that every day. All sides of this debate can show a lot of emotion because it's important, and I respect the emotion because people are emotional because it is important. But it is important most of all to respect, to listen, and to recognise that solutions that acknowledge the other people's points of view, those who are in a different position, is a crucial part of the answer.
Thanks, Angus. I'll start reading out some of the questions. Richard Lange is asking, it appears the speed to renewables is constrained by the capability of the network to manage the dispatchable power. What needs to be done to incentivize investment in dispatchable elements to the system, such as batteries? Yeah,
it's a great question. So this is Richard, I think it was, wasn't it, who asked the question? The great point Richard made here is that the limiting factor now on renewables is not necessarily our ability to build another solar farm. It's our ability to absorb those renewables into the grid. And to give you a sense of this, in South Australia, where there was very rapid investment in large-scale renewables as well as household solar, AEMO, the market operator, has had to curtail on a regular basis wind in particular from coming into the grid. They're now mandating that all solar cells can be turned off because they can't manage that quantum in the grid. So this is a really serious issue. And the renewables industry, I think that those who are really looking hard at this are recognising this problem. There are complementary fuel sources that can enable more renewables into the system. Alan Finkel points out that gas is one of those, and the gas is the perfect complement to renewables. And this is why the anti-gas mindset, I think, fails to recognise the complementarity here, and that is very, very important. The complementarity comes in a few different areas. There's very short duration dispatchability, which is power that you can access, a surge in the system that you can put in at very short notice, milliseconds even, for a relatively short period of time, often to ensure that the frequency of the system is maintained. Batteries are a really fantastic technology for that, and that's why we're investing alongside state governments in batteries. And as I said, we've just done in WA. But pump hydro, gas and hydrogen are the technologies that offer that dispatchability over longer duration. There's others as well, and I'm sure there's others on this webinar. Concentrated solar thermal is a really interesting technology for dispatchability that there's been a great group of people working on that here in Australia. It's hard slog, but starting to make real progress. But that longer duration is important. The incentives, Richard's question also asked about how we make sure there's incentives for it. Look, that's why we put in place the retailer reliability obligation. It's actually to start to send a price signal, strengthen, there already is a price signal, but strengthen the price signal for dispatchability. And that price signal does need to be stronger. So, there needs to be a strong incentive to make sure that people are putting that dispatchability in the system. We have that, and without going into the technical detail, our energy market on the East Coast does have that to some degree with what's called a cap, and with the volatility we're now seeing in energy prices, that's providing some incentive, but we're going to need to strengthen it. WA has a different system where there's a more direct incentive, but we are going to need to continue to strengthen these incentives. And the COAG reforms, now the National Cabinet reforms that we've been driving through, are to a significant extent about making sure those incentives are in place, but they'll need to strengthen in the coming years.
Thank you. There's a question from Ben Krasnostein. Noting your strong interest in land management, do you foresee a commercial approach by the Clean Energy Regulator with regards to soil carbon, environmental plantings, and other industrial methods pursuant to which farmers and investors can generate meaningful revenue streams?
Yeah, no, another great question. And the answer is yes. This is really exciting. I think farmers understand that when you really manage particularly pastures well, you can take your soil carbon level up from 1 or 2% up to 6, 7, 8%. You can really move the dial. And when you then look at how much carbon that's absorbing down to as much as a metre under the ground, these are really significant quantities. And so the key, as I said earlier, is measurement and permanence. It's making sure we know it's going to stay in the ground and being able to measure it at low cost. And so there are methodologies now which the Clean Energy Regulator oversees and ERAC updates that do this. The general view of the industry is, yep, we're starting to get that out there, but we can do a lot more if the cost of those technologies reduces and the methodologies are streamlined. And so we're doing a lot of work on that at the moment. And I think the potential here is enormous if we can get the measurement right. There's also broader, native vegetation methodologies which will continue to evolve. They've been very successful, of course. The savanna burning, for instance, has been an enormous success, encouraging Indigenous burning in the north of the country. And what a fantastic program that's been with Indigenous rangers. Justin Punch, who's the chairman of ARENA, I know, has been very involved with much of that work, and it's been very, very, very successful. So we will really do want to broaden this. The question also referred to industrial energy efficiency. Again, we want to broaden the methodologies that encourage industrial energy efficiency using the Climate Solutions Fund and crediting those activities. And as we strengthen the corporate demand and state government demand for credits, we think there's great potential here in industrial energy efficiency, and we're doing a lot of work now on this. We made some changes we announced in the budget where the Clean Energy Regulator will be leading the work on developing and refining those technologies, those methodologies. And that's an important change. It's a really important change because it's sending a signal. We want the methodologies to be developed faster. And we want the process of developing them to be more efficient. And the Clean Energy Regulator has fantastic capability in this area, so we're really looking forward. And we've funded them, we've given them extra funding to do that work. Thank
you. From David Nixon, Australia has always been an energy exporter. What are we going to look like in 40 years?
Yeah, as an energy exporter, and you're absolutely right. We've had a competitive advantage in affordable, reliable energy, and a competitive advantage as an exporter of energy to countries like Japan. I mentioned earlier, Korea, China, throughout Asia. We're a trusted supplier for so many, and we need to move to ensure that we remain strong in that position. So, the first energy exports. It really began with Asia and Japan with iron ore in the 1960s. It was the Menzies initiative to free up the iron ore market. And that was the beginning of this, because the next commodity was coal. More recently, it's been LNG. And Australia has been absolutely instrumental in the development of the global LNG sector, which is revolutionising gas around the world. You're seeing LNG import terminals spring up throughout Europe now at a really rapid pace, replacing Russian gas, which is an understandable geopolitical priority for Europe. So, we've played a critical role in that. And then, of course, the next opportunity is hydrogen, and I talked about a moment ago, and that opportunity is really opening up with Japan and will open up with other countries in the near future. So, yep, 40 years' time, I think we can be the energy superpower we already have. The balance will change. Balance always changes. But we have every reason to believe, to be optimistic about that future.
Thank you. There's a question from Bernie Macomb. In the Black Summer, many people in smaller communities were stranded without power for very long periods. With power from electric vehicles, you take it with you when retreating from fire. Snowy 2.0, with endless transmission lines, isn't it building vulnerability for some of these communities rather than resilience?
Yeah, so I mean, you're absolutely right. And some of those places during the summer were in my electorate. I saw it firsthand, and we're actually working on making sure that we're able to move in a more nimble fashion to deal with that next time around. I think we've learned a lot about how to deal with those situations. But the question was really about reliance on transmission. We're relying on transmission now. I mean, this is not a new issue. We already are. We rely on Snowy now. We rely on transmission lines from Snowy now. And indeed, during January, we lost that transmission, and it was a very big problem for us. You're absolutely right. In fact, the transmission builds that are happening now that we're underwriting, whether it's HumeLink or VNI West or PEC, VNI West is Victoria, PEC is South Australia, HumeLink New South Wales. Each one of them not only will obviously add a transmission line, they're actually to some extent duplicating transmission that's already there. So it will create more redundancy in the system, so to speak, which will reduce our risks that are already existent in the system. I mean, we had a terrible day, not just when Snowy went out, but when the South Australia Victoria Interconnect went out, and there was a point there where Portland was at a very serious risk. The Portland aluminium smelter of actually losing its electricity supply, and once the smelter loses its electricity supply for a couple of hours, it's finished. It'll never reopen. And it was a very hairy time for us. We got through it. We managed to find a way around that, and we had ministers on the phone with the market operator, in a very difficult circumstance. So that was successful. But I'm confident that with more transmission, we'll actually reduce those risks, not increase them. But it's an important point that you raise.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on renewable energy industrial precincts, and how can the federal government increase the impact of the state's ambitious energy plans?
Well, they're pretty ambitious already, so so I'm not sure. I think that the real issue, as I said earlier, with the pace of growth of renewables is incorporating them in a grid, which is going to make sure that they're reliable and affordable, and that we don't have big losses of supply as that new supply is coming in. So that's the challenge. I don't, the truth about ambition is ambition has to be delivered, and if it's not delivered, you've achieved nothing. So this is very important, and we are focused on delivery as a government, because ultimately so many Australians rely on affordable, reliable energy. So it's an important issue, and the important point for us is to make sure that we maintain a grid that is not going to fall over. Now, we saw real problems with this in South Australia. I mean, we know the playbook here when you get this wrong. When you don't have enough dispatchability, when you don't have balance, when you don't think about frequency control, it goes wrong, and the whole thing will stop. You can't keep going at the same pace if that's what occurs. So, our focus is on making sure these things work. Our focus is on making sure there's balance. Our focus is on making sure that we, maintain our grids. That's the key with these plans. Ambition, great. Delivery on that ambition, far more important.
Looks like we're out of time. I've got only one more question here from Matt Edwards. The power industry is one thing, but how do we reduce emissions in transport, industry, agriculture?
Yeah.
I note Boris Johnson's plans is to phase out petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030.
Yeah, no, again, great question. So, of course, electricity is easily forgotten in this debate because there's almost excessive focus on the electricity side. It's only 30% of emissions. It's the other 70% that's, and you know, I would say, I gave you the numbers earlier, Australia reducing, you know, its emissions in electricity grid 18% in the last decade, and it will continue on at that rapid pace in the next few years. There's no question about that. So our problem with electricity is making that system work as the balance of fuel sources changes. And then the real challenge is the other 70%, as you rightly said, transport, agriculture, industry. These are areas where we're really only just getting started. Yes, energy efficiency has been going extremely well in industry, for instance, but we've got a long way to go on the technology journey there. And that's really, if you look at our technology roadmap, if you look at our funding for ARENA and the CFC, if you look at many of the other initiatives like the Future Fuels initiative that I described earlier, if you look at the hydrogen hubs, much of this is about the area beyond electricity. If you look at soil carbon, which is obviously focused on agriculture, this is about focusing on that other 70%. I hope that people are as excited and focused on that other 70% as they are on the 30%. The 30% is where we're doing okay. We've just got to work out how to make sure we deliver and that we hold the thing together. The 70% is where there needs to be really smart people thinking about the hard problems that have to be solved in incorporating hydrogen into our industrial energy systems, in thinking about soil carbon in agriculture, in thinking about how we get set up the infrastructure to support the first wave of electric vehicles, which I think will be particularly fleet focused. There'll be the high-end Teslas, of course, but as we see the cost coming down, the economics will work best for fleets, and how we get that technology to work and incorporate it in our electricity system is going to be really challenging. So they're the problems that need a lot more focus, and of course that's been a very big part of our focus in the last 12 months.
Thank you so much, Angus. As we run out of time, I'd like to now introduce Alex Hawke to do a wrap up. Alex is Minister for International Development and the Pacific. He's Assistant Defense Minister and also a member for Mitchell. Now, Alex has been very actively partnering with our Pacific Island neighbors, assisting them with how to respond to COVID by increasing testing capacity, improving access to vaccines, and most of all, he's stepping up climate resilience through renewables in the Pacific. Thank you, Alex, for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Christina, and thank you, everyone, for your time and obviously being involved in what you're doing. These are very important discussions, and I wanted to say you would expect me as a member of the government to say Angus Taylor is doing a good job in his portfolio. But what Angus has actually done is bring great clarity and focus to the energy portfolio, and especially emissions reduction from a coalition government's point of view. And I've been in Parliament since 2007, and I can honestly say with all the different iterations of climate policy that we've had in opposition and in government, Angus Taylor's brought forward, I think, the most credible plan and the most forward-looking plan with the technology roadmap that has united the coalition, I think, completely behind what the government is doing. And that's very important given the history of this issue in Australia at the moment. So when you look at that technology roadmap, you can have great confidence that we're not going to pick the winners, as Angus says. We're looking for the right investments, but we're going to continue to evolve the plan based on what is technologically best for our planet and for climate policy. I might say that Angus also speaks about some of the transition matters, and I heard some of the questions there about gas. Look, I think when you look at how much is really available to Australia in terms of options, and you think about, we have so much of the world's resources and so much of the world's energy generation potential, often, you know, we are spoken about in a negative light in relation to climate. But I know through my diplomatic work in the foreign affairs portfolio and in the region in the Pacific, Australia is often leading the way in terms of policy at this juncture. We sometimes are not very good at advertising that, or in terms of you know, promoting that is what we're actually doing. When I look at what other countries are doing in the region, it doesn't really matter what level of power they are. You know, they are not meeting the environmental record of Australian development work, and I'm the International Development Minister as well. They're not concerned about the standards of environmental output, and in fact, many other countries are responsible for some pretty shameful environmental degradation in our region that Australia is often on hand to pick up and repair and certainly assist with. So, you know, and with Prime Minister Morrison, you know, I might just segue over to a little bit of the Pacific and some of the work that we're doing there in renewables in particular. But Prime Minister Morrison has put an emphasis on, you know, new environmental technology like waste reduction, you might have heard about that, and ocean plastics, which is very important to the Pacific. But equally in everything that we're doing in the infrastructure space, we have climate windows in all of that work. So the flagship program that we have in the region is the Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific, which is obviously a concessional finance facility. And the first announcements that we've made under that program, I think many of the people who are here today would be very happy with. We're building the second largest solar plant in the Markham Valley in Papua New Guinea. We're funding the transmission for the hydropower in Solomon Islands, a big hydropower at Tina River. And certainly a lot of the projects that we have in the pipeline are in line with our partner countries' priorities, but also committed to renewable. So, look, I don't know today. I think Christina's talking with me about coming on and maybe highlighting some of that work we're doing in renewable energy. And certainly we've built in climate windows into the money that we're doing, and emphasis on climate resilience and certainly in our humanitarian development space, where we do a lot in the region. There's a lot of opportunity for us to invest in high quality climate resilient infrastructure that will, you know, obviously save a lot of lives, money, time, and adapt the region to a changing world. So, Christina, I might leave it there. I just wanted to obviously, you know, mention a little bit about what we're doing in the region. I do think that Australia can be regarded as a very strong world leader in its environmental record. Certainly, Angus Taylor is setting us up for that. I think the technology roadmap will be successful, and I think it will dominate policy for many years to come.
Thank you, Alex. Our support to the Pacific is so critical to Australia and to the region. And that was a great warm up for the event we want to host with you. So very soon we'll come up with a date, and Alex can talk a lot more about the Pacific. Now, thanks again, Angus, for your time and also for your support to C4C and for making yourself available to discuss those very important points in terms of, you know, energy and your portfolio in emissions reductions. Thanks for everyone who participated tonight. I hope you can join us at the forthcoming next webinar on the 8th of December. We're having the Nationals and the UK Conservatives discussing the global challenges affecting farmers and post-COVID recovery. There will be a panel with the President of the National Party, Larry Anthony, National Senator Susan MacDonald, and our UK Conservative friends, Sam Hall, and the MPs, Philip Dunn and Claire Coutinho. So keep that date in your diaries, and I hope everyone enjoyed the event tonight. Stay safe. We hope to see you on the 8th.